I got started when I was 15 years old up in a school in Concord, New Hampshire, a place called St. Paul's, with a theophilosopher teacher by the name of Reverend John Walker. He taught about Martin Luther King and Howard Thurman and Benjamin Elijah Mays and Gandhi and all of the then very nascent thinking around love, nonviolence, and social activism. He was a big influence on myself, and then about 10 years before me on John Kerry, now the Secretary of State. John Walker was a very popular man, and he convinced me that love is the most significant force in the universe. In 2001, actually, I received a fax of a lifetime from Sir John Templeton, who started the Templeton Funds and is kind of a mega famous investor. He died in 2008. And the fax was really simple. It came down from Nassau in the Caribbean. It said, "Stephen, how would you like to start an institute that doesn't study human disease and human deficit, but rather studies the greatest human asset imaginable?" And I faxed back, "Sir John, that's a great idea. What are we talking about?" And he said, "Unlimited love," by which he meant a love that isn't caught up in pay it back or reciprocal gains or self-interest, but just, love and forget about it, as he used to say to me. And he said that was freeing, and it was the best way to live. It was the healthiest and the happiest way to live. So in my fax, I asked Sir John, what should we call this? His response by fax was, well, how about the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love? And I admit I had a slight moment of white male trepidation, because I thought, what kind of love are we talking about? And here I was in a big, massive academic medical center with the Cleveland Clinic and university hospitals and Case Western. I wondered what my friends were going to say to me about this endeavor. So I faxed back to Sir John, maybe we should call it the Institute for Creative Altruism, because altruism is a more science-y word that's accepted in a lot of research circles. But Sir John had science as well as spirituality and philosophy in mind, so he faxed back rightly, no, I think Unlimited Love, $8.9 million. And I faxed back, Sir John, I love that language, it jumps right off the page. And we were able to fund about 80 studies at universities from Stanford to Stony Brook, from Harvard to the University of Chicago, and really got the deep study of human generosity underway in about 2000, 2001, 2002. And a lot of people have recognized that. So now we still have ongoing projects, and that is my passion. Although I do love being a medical school professor in preventive medicine, because I'm convinced that when people are givers, so long as they don't overdo it and stress themselves out, they live much happier, healthier, and on average, even longer lives, which is absolutely true. There are so many wonderful scientists now who are tired of studying disease and want to study the great human strengths, like forgiveness, gratitude, self-control, kindness, generosity, and ultimately love. I tend to define love with the help of a long since deceased University of Chicago psychiatrist by the name of Harry Stack Sullivan. He said, when the happiness, security, and well-being of another means as much to you and is as real to you as your own happiness, security, and well-being, you love that person. Now look, I'm not drawing on Greek or Hebrew or any kind of difficult language. I'm just saying in common sense terms, that's a good definition. Think about love you might have for a close friend, or maybe love for somebody who's sick in the hospital, or maybe love for your family members, maybe a parent looking down at the crib of a newborn. This kind of idea that the happiness and security and well-being of another means as much and is as real to me as my own pretty much says a lot. And all the great humanitarians, the people like Gandhi or Mother Teresa or Cicely Saunders or Martin Luther King, you know, they all spoke about love. King talked about a love that does justice. So we've studied what happens in the human brain when people just think about helping others. And it turns out if you take people into a laboratory and put a brain scan device on top of their heads, a PET scanner, you give them a menu with 20 or so charities that they might just consider contributing to. When they have a eureka moment, that's what I'd like to give to, a part of the brain lights up, and it's an old, deeply evolved part of the brain. It's called the mesolimbic pathway. Don't write that down, but you can Google it. And it's the part of the brain that doles out feel-good chemicals like dopamine and serotonin, 2 of the 4 happiness chemicals. Of course, serotonin is used to treat depression. So here you have it. You just think about doing good, and your brain releases chemicals that make you feel happier. And this has been replicated, this kind of science. People have been looked at when they're doing face-to-face helping activity like volunteering in a literacy program for kids. It's really pretty exciting. There's also a hormone that the brain releases when we're involved in helping others, especially face-to-face. And this occurs in both men and in women, and it's called oxytocin. Some folks refer to it as the compassion hormone, but interestingly, it's also very strongly associated with trust, with a sense of tranquility, serenity, inner peace. So suddenly you begin to understand some of those old Norman Rockwell pictures on the old Saturday Evening Post covers. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You've got Hindus and Jews and Christians and secular existentialists and people of every color and class. They're all just putting their minds to the question, how can I use my talents to contribute to the well-being of others? And they look so tranquil. Their faces just look at peace. And I think what's happening there is that we're seeing the effects of oxytocin. They're getting their minds also, though, off the self and the problems of the self, the things in life that maybe are bothering them the most. Maybe that resentment, that bitterness, that hostility they have against somebody who did something that was unkind or ungenerous or hurtful 5 years ago, and they just can't shake it. There's no better way to get beyond that kind of destructive emotional state than helping others and then having confidence that with the passing of time, your perspective might broaden a little bit and you could figure out, well, maybe I could have said something a little differently or handled it a little differently than I did. But all that's really powerful stuff. We know that 76% of Americans say that the thing that makes them happiest in life is, quote, contributing to the lives of others. We know that when people volunteer at low, what are called low thresholds, just a couple of hours a week, volunteer in an area that they find to be meaningful, they have all kinds of benefits. In fact, one of the largest managed healthcare organizations in the United States is called United Healthcare. In the early 2010, they did a study, which I happen to be associated with. They did a national survey of about 5,500 Americans 18 and older. And they asked them, in 2009, did you do any volunteering? Turns out about 41% of Americans volunteered. These are adult Americans. Now, that number, 41%, holds pretty even over the years. You know, sometimes it's 38, 37%, but 40 is just about the number. How much did they volunteer on average? About 100 hours a year, a couple of hours a week. So again, not overdoing it here. And then we asked them questions about what they thought volunteering did for them. 68% said volunteering made them feel physically healthier. That's kind of like when you get off carbos and have protein for a few days, you just feel a little stronger. And it's actually a very reliable measure of health in medical studies. 96% of the volunteers said it made them feel happier. Now, this is a time when, I'm sorry to say, Americans are lagging behind many other parts of the world in terms of happiness. I think we're down to about 30th now, way behind places like Mozambique, where they may not have as much as we do, but they have more community and they have more pro-social helping tasks that are part of the scope and the expectations of life. So they're embedded in community. They're not just living these isolated, empty lives in a world of affluenza. Nope, they're finding meaning and gratification. So America is not doing too well in the international happiness scales that come out of the University of Lancaster in the UK. And here you have it. People are happier when they help others. That's pretty powerful stuff. I think that you can look at mental health, you can look at depression rates. One of my favorite studies began at the University of Berkeley in California in 1926. It was a, don't write this one down either, a prospective longitudinal study following 300 preteens, that's another way of saying 12-year-olds, right? And from every kind of racial background, every kind of economic class, educational level. The researchers interviewed these 12-year-olds, and they wanted to make get a sense of what made them tick. About 100 of these kids said, well, I want to do something with my gifts to help the world, to make a difference for humanity. And then they followed these kids every 10 years over the entire course of their lives. They do their medical records, they give them interviews, they give them all kinds of scales that test their emotional status. Turns out that the 100 kids who said, well, I want to help the world, they had lower levels of heart disease over the course of their lives, lower levels of diabetes and asthma, which are stress-related. They also had significantly lower levels of depression. And now these folks are actually in their 90s, their late 90s, and of course they're not all alive. But of the people who are alive, which might be about 85 or 87 of them last I heard, about 2/3 of the ones who were alive come from the 1/3 who as 12-year-olds said, hey, I want to use my talents to help humanity. And so what that tells you is that if you can think in these terms early on in life, it sheds a kind of protective halo that will follow you your whole life long. We've been studying very actively Alcoholics Anonymous, which is an organization founded in the 1930s for alcoholics. They get together, sometimes even every morning. They have a meeting. They support each other. They give their testimonies about how they're staying dry. We wanted to know how important it was for alcoholics to help other alcoholics. Do they recover faster? Do they recover better? There's actually something called the 12th step in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, where you help other alcoholics, drawing on your own experience, drawing on your grassroots knowledge. You become a wounded healer. You help someone else who's experienced your problem. And that gives you a sense of wisdom and insight that probably no professional has. So we found out that if people go dry at day one and you follow them 1 year, the high helpers, the high quartile helpers, have about a 40% recovery rate. So after a year of going dry, about 40% of those people are still dry. They're not drinking, they're not relapsing. And how about the low helpers? Their recovery rate is only 22%. So the newspaper article on this one was you double the likelihood of recovering from alcoholism in 1 year if you help other alcoholics. So we call that the helper therapy principle. And it turns out to hold good in all sorts of settings, whether it's Narcotics Anonymous, whether it's rehab programs for kids with criminal backgrounds and substance abuse issues. It holds very well. So I think that's powerful stuff to think about and reflect on. There are about 8 or 9 studies, some of which we supported, that just look at old folks, older adults, you know, people who might be 60 years of age and older for a 15-year period, or maybe 65 and followed for 20 years. And these are studies done at Brown and University of Michigan and Stanford and all kinds of good places. Turns out that after you factor out all of the background information, medical health and so forth, so it doesn't confound the study, the people who are involved in helping others, who are finding meaning and joy and hope in helping others in this golden age of their life, they're outliving the ones who are just, shall we say, getting up at noon in Sun City for a martini. The helpers are living on average about 2 to 2.5 years longer. So they're living longer, they're happier, they're much less susceptible to depression because they're not so focused on the loss of old friends who they might have known over the course of a lifetime, because they're too involved, they're too engaged in contributing to the lives of others. And that even makes old age and the possibility of death in the next number of years acceptable. So there's something wonderful about helping others. It has a remarkable number of hidden gifts, if you will. So those are things I'd say. You might ask, well, is this kind of behavior, is it innate? Is it wired into us? Or is it something we pick up from environmental influences or from good role models? Well, role models really count. This kind of behavior, you know, listening to a guy like me is not going to get you where you need to go, but hopefully you know enough people in your life who inspire you by their own activities. They're passing the torch, and you're holding it now, and you're moving forward in your generation to make a difference in the world. And by the way, that will ultimately make you the happiest and the healthiest and probably the most long-lived. Again, as a generalization, there are exceptions to all these things. People in their 20s get in accidents or have sudden diagnoses and the like, but as a scientific generalization, these are pretty hard facts. But altogether, when you look at this, there's just something to be said for the perennial spiritual wisdom. There's an old passage in the book of Proverbs: those who help others will themselves be helped. It's been said, 'tis better to give than to receive. Even Shakespeare in The Merchant of Venice talks about the quality of mercy as twice blessed. It blesses those who receive, but also those who give. What we're learning about is that being in touch with that capacity is really important. And yes, it does go right back to childhood. And by the way, there have been a lot of studies now done with empathy and compassion in very young children. It suggests that we kind of come equipped with these capacities, but the question is, what buttons get pushed? You know, sometimes if you live in a really violent world and everybody tells you, I don't do nothing for nothing. I heard that from somebody off the Long Island Expressway not too long ago. You know, it's kind of sad. You learn all the wrong things. You learn the message that somehow if you help others without a payback, you're a sucker and you're dumb and you're a fool and you're not manly. But indeed, you know, the reality is that we need to change that message. People say, don't worry about payback, just pay it forward. Do a lot of good with your lives, help others, make a difference. You may not see those people who are affected by you and what you teach them by your behaviors, but down the road, you know, have confidence that you've helped them discover and have confidence in their own good nature. But yeah, you know, you can have bad parenting, you can have abusive parenting, you can live in such a stressed environment financially that, you know, it's just really hard to stay in touch with the goodness within us. You can be influenced by negative peer pressure, by negative media. You can get into bad social structures where hurtful behavior is rewarded. So I don't say that this capacity is so strong in us that it can't be overwhelmed under certain conditions. Some people, I think, are just so busy in life that they don't have a chance to connect in a caring way with the people around them. Although I'll tell you, almost every healthcare professional I've ever known has said that when they don't stay in touch with their patients, when they don't connect with them, when they don't ask them, gosh, this must be tough, how are you handling it? When they don't express some kind of compassion, they themselves get burned out, they lose interest in being doctors, and they even become depressed and have problems with substance abuse. And in fact, that's a scientific fact. So the point is, you know, take a look at House. He's an interesting TV character. He treats patients as puzzles, not persons. He's probably a pretty good diagnostician, but in the end, is he happy? No. In fact, for the most part, he's stressed out and ready to blow his brains out, as far as I can tell. So there's something about this simple truth. It's good to be good, and science says it's so. Every great spiritual and moral tradition says it's so. Hinduism talks about a false self and a true self. Buddhism, Judaism, all the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Islam, all the African faiths of note, everything teaches us the great paradox of life, that in the giving of self lies the discovery of a deeper and a happier and a more gratified self. There's a great Jewish theologian by the name of Martin Buber, and he wrote a book called I It, I Thou. Basically, he was saying there's two ways to live your life in the world. I, it. I'm the center of the universe. Everything revolves around me. And if people aren't meeting my interests, then I have nothing to do with them. But then there's I, thou. Discovering, and it's an emotional, it's an intellectual, but it's also a spiritual transformation. Discovering the supreme value of the other as other, not as someone who's just doing my bidding, but as an end in him or herself. That's the great truth of the moral life and the spiritual life. And when you can live that way, there's still an I it, I thou. The I is there, but you know what? It's a bigger, happier, better, more creative, more resilient I. In fact, people who live for others and find meaning in serving others do much better on post-traumatic growth studies where they've gone through hardship in life and even been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress syndrome, but they get over it, and they get over it through helping others. So that's my advice to everybody. Stay in touch with your better half. Form friendships in college and in graduate school and professional school and your whole life long. Form friendships that aren't, well, my friends are just the people I party with. Some of that's okay, don't get me wrong. But really, your friends should be the ones who share your story, who share your narrative, who share your excitement about making a difference in the world. And they'll be your deeper friends. You know, they're the kinds of people who, if you start a non-profit 501c3 to help the needy in some way, shape, or form that moves you, you know, they're the people you want on your board of directors because they're your true friends. They're the ones who are going to tell you when you're kind of going off course and not doing what's true to your values. So you will have deeper friendships, and you'll have more meaning, and you'll have a better life. And so it's good to be good, and now we know it's so. Well, you know, Plato said, know thyself. There's nothing more important to a flourishing life than discerning or finding your true calling. What is it that really brings passion and excitement and creativity and generosity into your everyday life? That in itself is the coin of greatest value. It's worth everything. So many people, you know, they are successful economically, they have all the money in the world, and then they hit 40 or 50 and they go through what's called a midlife crisis. They wonder, what's the meaning of it all? They realize that the best thing to do is to do the thing that really calls you to service and let the rest take care of itself. I'm not saying be naive about money. I'm not naive about money. But you know, that's a kind of byproduct or a side effect of what I'm really called to do. When you're doing something that you really don't feel called to do, it's hard to find life very meaningful, and it's hard to be happy. The other thing I would quickly say is that when you do things that you don't feel called to, it's usually a bad thing for the people who hire you. Because, you know, you're going to have what I call a conflict of commitment. You know, you've got your day job, but your heart's someplace else. Of course, you know, it takes a little luck, but it also takes a lot of persistence and a lot of conviction. You just have to realize that when push comes to shove, you're better off and the world around you is a lot better off if you can be doing the things that really light your fire. A lot of people wonder if there's any universal truth in the world today. Everything is personally relative. You know, I think this, but that's just me. Or I think that, but that's just me, and I wouldn't expect you to agree. I don't think there are a whole lot of universal truths necessarily, but there are some. And one truth, whether you check out every great perennial tradition of wisdom and now all of the good science, there's just one really fundamental truth that you want to start with. There may be others, but start with this. It's good to be good, and science says it's so.